Does dry tooling have a grading problem? Katie McKinstry Stylos is one of the top dry toolers in the world, specializing in big roofs. In 2023, Katie sent a line above the sky, becoming the fourth woman to climb D15. This past summer, she returned to Project Parallel World, D16, D15 plus, other, and let's just say she has some questions. While tomorrow's world is somewhat of a benchmark for grades in dry tooling, compared to rock climbing, consensus is hard to come by. Factors such as DTS versus Aniiu, tactics for manufacturing difficulty, the changing nature of routes, and human variables like ego all play a part in grade discord. In this episode, we chat about the complexity of grading at the highest level of dry tooling, how you don't have to comp to crush or need specialized tools, how Katie came to climbing after a competitive horseback riding career, what balancing her roles as an artist, business owner, and climber looks like, and what the process was like in developing new dry tooling gloves with Aniiu. All that plus more in our conversation. As for Ice Beta, did you know we're more than just the podcast? Our online magazine, The Cooler, features essays and adventure stories, discussions about tactics and gear, destination reviews, and many other topics. For now, it's all free to enjoy. That is the podcast and magazine. And we rely on listeners and readers just like you to keep it going. If you like what we're doing, head to icebeta.com and become a member. We have both a free tier and paid subscriber option. Along those lines, a big thank you to new members, Phil, Michael, Coulter, Charles, Mason, Jacob, Ilyana, and Steve. We'll get to the conversation with Katie right after a quick message from our sponsors. What do you get when you combine 30 years of ice climbing and product design chops? Well, if you're into gloves, you get Aniiu, a boutique climbing brand on a mission to produce the best ice climbing and dry tooling gloves around. Doug, June, and the rest of the team spare no expense in the pursuit of durable, dexterous, and waterproof. Best yet, they are made from recycled textiles, which saves waste from the landfill, and they are robustly built so they won't end up there anytime soon. To learn more about your friend in the cold, head to aniiu.com. That is ANIIU.com.
If you're listening to my voice right now, it's because for you, ice season never really ends. It just kind of blends into the next route. Every off-season climb you do is training for the next swing, scratch, or kick. Wouldn't it be cool to never stop ice climbing? Well, Furnace Industries has the ice climbing training gear and dry tooling equipment you need so you can just keep going. They have gym-safe indoor ice climbing tools and the largest variety of dry tooling holds in America. There's replacement picks and front points and all kinds of winter goodies. With their gear, it's always ice season. Check out more ice and dry tooling gear at furnace-industries.com.
Where I want to start is, I want to know who Katie McKinstry Stylos is. Because I'm not going to say you're an enigma, but I feel like you kind of like jumped onto the scene and very quickly established yourself as one of the top outdoor female dry toolers in the world. I mean, you were one of a handful of women to send D15 last year with your send of A Line Above the Sky, and you were the fourth woman to do it. And it just, you know, from an outside perspective, it just seems like your progression's been very rapid. And, you know, in talking with you, maybe you can set the record a little straight, but let me stop talking and ask again, you know, who are you and how did you get to D15 so quickly?
Yes, I'm Katie McKinstry Stylos. I grew up in Boise, Idaho, and I now live in Bozeman, Montana. I moved here in 2018. My background is in horse riding. I grew up riding horses. I grew up competing horses, and I did that for the majority of my life and switched over to climbing and quickly became an ice climber and then a dry tooler. And now that's kind of consumed my free time, if you will. But along with being a climber, I'm also an artist and I'm also a business owner. So between that and also being a wife and having friends, like I feel like I'm just kind of, in a way, I feel like I'm everybody else trying to balance a million things. I'm trying to balance having a pretty significant dedication to a sport, as well as being in a serious relationship, as well as being part of a community, and as well as owning a business and trying to make that as successful as I possibly can. So right now, that's me. I'm doing life with all those different things.
Multifaceted.
Yeah, exactly.
Do your friends think of you as a dry tooler?
Oh gosh, I don't know. I think so. I think most of my climbing friends I met through the ice climbing community here in Bozeman. I used to work at the climbing gym in town called Spire, and I met most of my community there, including Kevin Linlaw. But I also like have a lot of connections still in the horse world and a lot of friends still in that world. So I think it just kind of depends on which world I met the people in. I think now, like, my horse friends see me as a horse rider who doesn't ride horses anymore, and my climber friends probably see me as the dry tooler.
I ask because you have a lot of like these different parts of your life that you integrate, but also seem to keep maybe separate. And as far as people, as athletes go, like, do you consider yourself like a pro dry tooler?
Gosh, I don't know. It depends on what your description of professional is, because I do have two sponsors. I don't get paid by my sponsors, but I do get support through gear and whatever. So if that's your definition of being a professional, then yes. But if your definition of being a professional is being a paid athlete, then no, I'm not. I make my living having my own business, and that is my support and income. So that's hard for me to answer. I think like if I were to look at myself, I'd say, I don't know. I think I like to think of myself as somebody who does dry tool or does climb a lot and focuses on the sport pretty heavily, but I also think that I do other things than just dry tools specifically. But it's hard for me to say I'm a professional just because I kind of feel like I'd have to be getting paid. And I think a lot of that also comes from in the horse world. To be defined as like a professional horse rider in the competition world, you have to be getting paid either by like clients or sponsors. So that's kind of where my thought process comes from, I think. I do teach clinics and like have taught people. So I think in the sense of like being somebody that I feel like I can like give knowledge to people, maybe that would make me a professional. But it's really hard for me to like put that marker of definition on myself. So I would say maybe.
Yeah.
I could be.
You did mention, you're a partner, a community member, artist, and the art pays the bills. So what is your medium?
Yeah, so shameless plug, my business is called Highlight Designs. Follow it on the gram. My medium is I make art out of old climbing rope. So I guess you had mentioned like kind of feels like my life is fairly divided, but in a way I feel like my business and my climbing world are pretty connected because of that medium. So yeah, I make art out of old climbing rope. Usually the art is images of mountains. Every now and again there's something obscure thrown in there. I'm also a graphic designer. So I'd say right now my business is like 75% fine art through rope art, and then 25% graphic design, doing logos or like pamphlets and kind of your classic, what you think of graphic design is what I'm doing.
I don't know why I'm stuck on this thread of like identity, but like you don't post on your personal account about your artwork often, and vice versa, right? So you could almost, like, if you go to your website, like, you describe yourself as multivariable, but you do note that you dry tool. Like, is that a conscious choice to sort of be like, hey, like, this is my artist side and I want to kind of keep that as like art centric, and then this is sort of like my personal side? Is that like a conscious decision to sort of like try to maintain separation? Or
This was a very big kind of personal thought process that went into this. But like I said, prior to being a climber and an artist, I used to ride horses, and my job was horses and my passion was horses. And it was like super, super combined. There was no distinction between the two. And I made my passion my job, and I got really burned out. And then I had this like pretty significant identity crisis of who I was. And so when I decided to go to school, I really didn't know what I wanted to do. And I literally like flipped through a pamphlet of different degrees you could get at Montana State. And I always kind of liked doing art. So I picked graphic design. And that's kind of when I really wanted to have my identity of like graphic design and art is my job. And it's something that I do and I love to do, but it's something I can leave and put to the side, and I can just like, it's funny saying that because I'm kind of constantly always working, but at the same time, it's not my passion. I love doing it. It really is a fulfilling career, but it's my career. And then I have my dry tooling or my climbing and my ice climbing. That is what feels like my passion now. And keeping them separate feels like I'm able to manage my burnout with both a little bit easier. So whether that's being like, okay, I'm like getting kind of overwhelmed by the climbing, or I'm like ready for a break. Oftentimes when I'm in that stage, I can focus more on my art and I can kind of put myself into that. And then when I'm starting to get burned out and need a break from my creative space, I can move into my climbing. Having this obvious distinction between the two has helped me personally manage my burnout and kind of manage my time easier.
I knew I was onto something.
Yeah, you picked it up. You're on it.
I do the same thing. Like I have to accept you. If you like try to become friends with me on Instagram for my personal account, I accept almost no one. Cause like, I don't want you to follow me. Like, I'm just a guy.
Right.
Like, I don't like I haven't posted in like 6 months, and I was doing this like 30-day art challenge. Like, I don't want you seeing my junk art. I had fun doing it, but like, it's junk art.
Sure.
And like, yeah, I'm not going around being like, I'm the ice climbing dry tooling podcast guy. Like, that is such a small part of like what I do and how I define myself. It's like, it's a fun project, but like,
there's more to you than just the podcast, even though the podcast is the most visible part of you.
That's true. I mean, you sound like you've made a very concerted effort to manage your energy levels and sort of this separation between, passion and work. If you don't mind. So what happened with competitive horse riding that sort of led you to where you are today? Like that you made this firm stance that like, I need to have this separation.
To kind of give people just like a little bit of background of my life kind of before climbing, because I feel like the context is probably helpful. I grew up kind of the classic horse girl, the girl who was like obsessed with horses and had horses on my folders and the whole shebang, and made it entirely my identity and who I was and what kind of drove me. When I was 13, I stopped going to public school and I did online school, and I worked at a barn 6 days a week starting when I was 13 years old. I came from a place where I couldn't afford riding lessons, so I would work off my lessons, and I couldn't afford my own horse, and so I would work off my ability to ride my trainer's horses. So yeah, I worked 6 days a week from 7:30, 8 in the morning to 6 o'clock at night, and then I would go home and I would do school after. I did that, worked at a barn in Idaho until I was 17. And I had graduated by this point, and then I moved to Washington and I got basically like a barn manager position. I was managing a barn with, I think we had like 12 or 13 horses, and managing the training, the feeding, the vet, as well as competing kind of across the country. So traveling to different states with horses and doing competitions and grooming, which means like I would take care of all my trainers' horses. I would get the horse ready. I would take care of the horse after competing. And so I moved to Washington, and at this point I finally had my own horse and was doing everything there. And eventually my horse had an accident and I had to put it down, and it was kind of like the breaking point for me in the sport, in the sense that I was like, not only did I like kind of take a step back and look at my experience and be like, oh, I'm a little emotionally damaged, but I'm also exhausted and burnt out, and I don't want to do this anymore. But with that being said, it took me like, I think a solid 2 years to really finally take my final step out of the sport. And I think that just like when I finally took a step back and was navigating, kind of trying to find who I was outside of being a competitor and a horse rider, was when I realized like, oh, I want to do this differently. Like, I don't want to have this really significant blurred line between my passion and my job, because I think like I still have a really deep passion for horses, and I have this like incredibly high level skill that I don't use anymore ever. And in a way that's really hard. So I don't have any sort of horse experience going on in my life at the moment. And maybe that's a little bit sad, but maybe I'll have some of that someday in the future. But I think because I was so deeply burned out and had like a fair amount of emotional trauma from my experience in a lot of ways of like working that hard when I was that young, I really had to navigate how I balance my work and my kind of life and my passion now to make it sustainable and be able to not essentially be triggered in a way that I was when I was younger.
Yeah. Do you think you sort of like have this, like, you seem like you tend to like go all in on things? Do you think that's accurate?
Yeah, 100%.
Okay.
Just to kind of reel back, and I'll come back to this, but I did meet my husband at the farm that I worked at in Washington, and he still works at that farm, and we go back every summer when he's working, and it's a really amazing, it's where we got married. It's a really amazing and special place, and the people are incredible. And then he's the one that got me into climbing. He was really into mountaineering. And then that's kind of where it started. And then the more we started kind of getting into ice climbing and whatever, and we had climbed in Bozeman, and then we moved here in 2018 and was working at a climbing gym, knew I wasn't going to be able to make that sustainable long term. So went to school on my dad's GI Bill and got a degree in graphic design, started my business, and now we're kind of here. But I think I've always been really driven. My parents like to say that I've always been one to set a goal and make it happen. I've always really loved having a goal and working really hard to that goal. And now that applies to my climbing, but it also is applied to my business and my involvement in the community as well. I've always been a person who's had a lot on my plate, and it's something that I'm working on really hard in therapy, because oftentimes there's too much on my plate and I get really overwhelmed, and it's all self-induced. And I think a lot of that comes from my experience in the horse world. Is the idea was, you see something that needs to get done, then you should do it right away. Like there's always work to be done. And so I'm just naturally a person who is constantly finding something to do. And I'm not very good at not doing something.
You're now in Bozeman, and Joe got you into climbing, and you started with ice climbing. But what was the progression, and then what ultimately brought you to dry tooling?
Yeah. I very first started climbing while I was still in the horse world. It was kind of a way for Joe and I to get to know each other and like get off the farm. We would go to a cute little rock gym in Olympia, Washington. And then my very first time going outside climbing ever was ice climbing in the desert of southern Idaho. Oh. It was a climb called Hidden Falls, and it's like kind of down in this slot canyon surrounded by burned sagebrush. And it really is like a significant moment in my climbing because I remember it so well, and just being totally taken aback that waterfalls freeze, which I had never thought of before. And then not only do they freeze, but you can climb them. And in Idaho, like it's just this like wildly stark contrast against the desert. So got into ice climbing, and that was winter of 2015. So Joe and I had done, like, we did some mountaineering, and we did some more ice climbing, really more specifically to kind of evolve our mountaineering. And we did like a rock climbing road trip where we lived in the car for the fall, and then we lived in the car during the winter, and we climbed in the Adirondacks and did like my first lead at Chapel Pond and my first multi-pitch at Chapel Pond. I don't remember the name of the route for my first lead. I'm trying to remember. Everybody will probably assume what it is. I can't remember. We just talked about this yesterday, and I can't remember the name of it. But Chenard's Gully was the first multi-pitch.
Maybe Chenard's Gully was
Yeah, that was the first multi-pitch.
Cool.
Super fun. Along kind of that ice climbing road trip, we had stopped in Bozeman, had climbed in Michigan, So we'd kind of climbed at a bunch of the hot spots, not including Ouray. And Bozeman was definitely, I think, the place that, the most obvious spot, like being in the West, which for me, it really felt like home. And then just Highlight is just really special. A lot of people talk about it kind of being this like a magical experience, and it's no different for me. So Bozeman became home. Eventually kind of got to the point where was ice climbing more and wanted to kind of get stronger, but I didn't want to get stronger by having to kind of adjust where my risk level was at. I really wanted to make sure I was still climbing within my ability, but also my mental kind of comfortability, if that makes sense. So dry tooling kind of felt like this kind of next step to get stronger, but in a way like safer way, because there's bolts and it's okay if you fall, even though you still have sharp things. But along the way, I also had met Kevin working at the climbing gym. He really, really tried me to like get me to go to the mountain project, and I was really hesitant and like pretty scared of dry tooling and didn't really want anything to do with it. And eventually, after I'd quit Spire, was when he finally got me to go into the gym. Got to kind of learn from him and have like somebody who's really positive and makes you very comfortable was really key in helping me kind of at the beginning. And at that point, I'd gone out and like helped him, or I'd helped belay on Groggy and got to see the projecting that you can do in dry tooling. And that was really new for me because in my experience, like projecting ice climbs is not really a thing just because they change constantly and it's never this consistent medium, right? And it's either like you're capable of climbing this or you're not, versus projecting something you can get kind of so nitty gritty detail within kind of this route. And that was really new for me, and it really spoke to me, I think. So really started to kind of get into the dry tooling and doing it more, I'd say like 2020, I think was when I started doing it more and climbing. But it never really was like this obvious marker of like, okay, I'm an ice climber and now I'm a dry tooler now. Like, I think I was dry tooling just as much as everybody else is, and probably was just as scared about it and really kind of hesitant about it as a lot of climbers are. And then all of a sudden, it just kind of seemed like this natural progression of like, I was doing a little bit more because I was going into the mountain project with Kevin and he was helping me learn skills. And then I was like going up to the bingo cave and hopping on some routes there and running laps on some of the dry routes in Highlight Canyon just to build more endurance for ice climbs specifically. And then all of a sudden it was like Kevin had asked Joe, my husband Joe, and I to join him and Joe Wagner on a trip to Italy for the first time, which was in August of 2022. So that kind of gives you a rough timeline of like where I started. And then it just the dry tooling felt like this really kind of natural progression. I just happened to have the encounter with Kevin that really, I think, changed my journey. And he kind of allowed me to see this sport in a different light, in the sense that I could project it and like get involved in routes in a way that I couldn't with the ice climbing. With that being said, I still love ice climbing. It just seems like dry tooling seems to be a little bit more of a focus at the moment.
You think you'll ever get back to ice climbing?
Oh, for sure. I have lots of goals and things I want to do on ice. For me, it kind of feels like one of those things of like, this level of dry tooling I'm doing is hard enough that I really have to be focused on the training, and I can't separate it. I can't do both. Like, I either like if I want to climb these projects and if I want to climb this hard, I have to be all in focused on my training. So like I went ice climbing yesterday and it was super fun and it was really casual, and at some point I'll ice climb more. But right now the dry tooling is definitely the focus.
Sort of like a culmination of where you're at with time and availability and training, and sort of like at this particular point in the sport. I can understand that. A little bit more gradual than maybe my initial impressions were as far as like how you developed, because, you know, if you started ice climbing in 2015, you know, it's been about 9 years, and maybe that provides a little bit more of a reasonable ascension.
Yeah.
Perhaps. With dry tooling though, You were telling me before that, like, once you got to like the WI5 level and you were contemplating more variable condition ice climbs, WI6 tends to get more like hanging daggers, things like that, a little bit more precarious and maybe less tenable or safe. And that was a big motivation. And it seems like that was a motivation for, at some level, Kevin too, mitigating risk. With that said, like as you've gotten more comfortable with like falling on tools and things like that, like are there some of these more like alpine-y mixed climbs that are someday dreams that you have?
Yeah, I think it's kind of one of those things of like ignorance is bliss, right? So like I think when I first got into climbing, I had these like pretty big mountain objectives and like these huge ice climbing, mixed climbing dreams or whatever. And now I think about it like, oh, no way. But something that has kind of stuck with me is, and my husband Joe, is like, I think a really awesome climb to do someday would be the Cassine on Denali. We've done some mountaineering in the past, and I just feel like that's kind of where, like, if I were to climb the Cassine, I think that's kind of like my dream alpine climb. There's like enough people that have climbed it and lots of knowledge that I think you can learn a lot. There's so much that you can kind of take from other people. I think in regards to like, for me, I've always been like a planner, and I kind of like to know what I'm getting into. And I think that's why projecting I like it so much, is because I can really lay out all the details of a route and get really personal with it, versus like big adventure, scary, unknown has always been really hard for me, and is something that the more I climb, the harder time I have kind of pushing through to like make it happen. I really like to know kind of like what I'm getting into, especially like having taken some AVI classes now. Like I have taken my AVI 2, and just knowing kind of more of the hazards and the risks and seeing close calls and wanting to make sure that I'm around for a long time is important to me. So to answer your question, I'd love to hop on the Cassine one day. Is kind of my alpine dream. But I'm hoping this summer, I'd really like to take my dad up the Disappointment Cleaver on Rainier this summer. But we'll see if that happens. But so yeah, there's definitely some fun, straightforward, what feels like more attainable alpine routes for me that I'd like to do someday.
In competitive horse riding, were there particular elements that would cross over to projecting? Like, were there, I guess, like, what were the nuances that you'd have to pay attention to optimize for performance? And like, are there parallels between competitive horse riding and projecting specifically that you see nowadays that sort of maybe attracted you in the first place to competitive horse riding? Or
yeah, that's a great question. When I just right off the bat, when I think about it, I kind of feel like maybe there's more crossover with like the competitive side of horse climbing, with maybe competitive dry tooling, ice climbing, but I don't compete in the ice climbing circuit, so it's hard for me to speak on that. But for me, like I've always kind of said that the thing that I miss most about horses is the connection, like this really deep, personal, kind of soulful connection with this animal that doesn't speak the same language as you. And I miss that a lot. And so in a way, for me, projecting is a way to like get really deep and really connected to a place. And it almost feels a little bit parallel to that. Like I can really find myself like really getting dedicated and connected on a deeper level to a certain location or a certain route that you might not otherwise if you're just like going in for a day and climbing a beautiful line and leaving, which is special and beautiful in its own way. But the journey of projecting is, I've always kind of described it as, it's a little bit like reading your favorite book or this really all-consuming story, right? Of like each chapter is kind of different phases of the projecting, and the very end of the book is the send. But really what makes the book so great is the book itself and every chapter that led up to the send. For me, it's just the connection that I get to feel to that specific route. I always kind of say that like riding horses is kind of like a drug, you know, it's like kind of really liking alcohol or really liking coffee or something. It's like loving coffee and then you want to get off of coffee and then you drink tea. And like tea is good, but it's not as good as coffee or something like that. So
it'll never be coffee.
It's never coffee, So it's like the connection is like, it's amazing. It's just never quite the same that I got with horses, but it's still really good and I love it and it's amazing. It's why I do it. But I do miss the connection that I had with the horses for sure.
Along those lines, because you've been going back to the same cave for 3 years now, what is the story for you for Tom's Cave?
So Tom's Cave is short for Tomorrow's World, but it's also called Tom's Cave because Tom Ballard, who is no longer with us, was the main developer in the cave and put up the majority of the routes in DTS style. I heard about Tom's Cave through Kevin, who knew Tom and had first climbed there with him. To my understanding, Tom's Cave was in a lot of ways kind of the foundation for this style of climbing, of big hard roof climbing, and had the first D15, a line above the sky, as well as just being kind of I think has become a little bit of a proving ground for a lot of climbers. And for me to be able to go to Tom's Cave, especially with Kevin, and feel like I got to know Tom a little bit through Kevin was a way to kind of connect to the cave a little bit more. And then when I was there in 2023, when I was working line, Angelica Reiner came and I got to climb with her for a day, and super wonderful. And just another day to kind of experience Tom through her eyes, and because she knew him too. And then getting to hear about Tom through Chris Snowbeck. So it was a great way for me to kind of connect to the cave as well as the route, A Line Above the Sky, and kind of get an idea. And also for me to be in a space and feel just so grateful that he left behind something incredibly visionary to the community, that we, even though Tom's not with us anymore, like the fact that we have this cave and it's still here and people are still going, and it's what seems to be the most popular cave in the world for this type of dry tooling is pretty incredible. And so my experience in the cave has just been really nothing but positive. Everybody that goes there is kind, and I've gotten to climb with pretty incredible people that have all gotten to know Tom. Not 100% sure if that answers your question, but that's kind of my general experience and knowledge of Tom's Cave.
Well, we're going to be spending the rest of the conversation probably around this topic, so
yeah,
I'm sure
totally.
we'll fill in the details. Earlier, you mentioned you like having something that is more predictable than maybe like alpine climbing. And yet, you've also dedicated yourself extensively to certain routes. And this is my ignorance, so I'm going to rely on Matteo Pilon here, who basically said that you're one of a handful of people that will attempt a route, a project for dry tooling without knowing the outcome. I'm relying on his intel. Maybe you can correct me from your experience as well, but it seems that maybe more folks are willing to try a project that might take only a few days, maybe a few weeks at max. But, here you are devoting months at a time to try to make a route happen. And so what is your relationship to these projects that you choose and the process of projecting? And what is that balance of like knowing that I've done as much as I could for training and like I'm as fit as I can be, and let's just see what happens? Like, how do you think about these as you're going into projects, and like what is the process like once you're actually doing it?
I think in general, to go back to what you said about like comparing like what I said about alpine climbing, kind of having an idea of like what I'm getting into, at least I know when I'm getting into projecting, I'm not going to be like killed by an avalanche or something like that, right? So there's like that peace of mind, and I think that's kind of why I'm drawn by it, is like the unpredictability of like hazards is a little bit more manageable. But with the predictability of outcome is different in the sense that like send versus no send. For me, projecting is an emotional journey. There are big highs and there's big lows. And each route I've done has been very different. So for example, when I first climbed Edge of Tomorrow, my first trip to Tomorrow's World, I really had no idea what to expect. I had no idea what I was capable of. It was my first time really dedicating myself to a project and like kind of learning what my style is. And for the most part, my style of projecting is really slow. My battle with like head game and how I feel physically is like something that I'm constantly working on every single day that I'm projecting. And so the first trip was really just navigating that. How does it feel to wake up every day, go to the same cave every day, have the same routine every day, get on the same route every day, work on the same holds every day? It's this very consistent project, and like, how do you process that? And so I learned a lot from that trip, and then kind of projecting Oblivion, which felt like right at my limit. And so it was like this positive, went home with the send of like, oh my gosh, I can do this, but then like felt bummed, but then also motivated by getting one move away from the finish on Oblivion that trip, which then motivated me to come back the next year. And then the second trip, Line, it was this big emotional journey, but it also was this really like, I feel like that trip for me was really connecting to the cave and the history of the cave. That's when I felt like I like connected to Tom through like Angelica and Kevin and Chris. And I think that was through Line and like the history of the sport. That trip was, again, felt really like I was fine tuning my projecting style and really just learning like, what do I do when I first get there, which is hop on the route for the first time, which might not even be doing the moves. Like it might just be going from bolt to bolt and looking at holds and just working through the fear of like being exposed and you're like back in a place you haven't been in a while. That for me can be really difficult. Like some people can, it's amazing to me, like how fast like Kevin can project and he can just get on the route and like look at moves and figure them out really fast and get to the red pointing process a lot faster. Versus myself, it seems to take a lot longer. And like the meat of the projecting is just like working sections, working moves specifically, figuring out the micro beta. How do I need to put my hand to hit this hold on using my tool, and where for me is the crux, and how many times do I need to work that crux to feel confident? So when I'm there for the big burn, I know I can get through it, kind of thing. Like that's the meat of the projecting, and then eventually you get to the red point goes. And the red point goes usually are, you try it for the first time and you learn something, you're like, oh, I'm not quite ready to try to climb through this section. So you go back to the projecting mode of like back to learning again. And then kind of talking about this trip this fall, really, I feel like this trip was a huge learning process for me. And I feel like I've grown more as a climber from this trip and this route than I've ever before. I kind of went into it with an idea of what I thought the route was going to be like, because I had climbed the 13 and then I climbed Oblivion the 14 and then I climbed Line the 15. And I really felt like I had the idea of what the progression of the grades felt like in Tom's Cave specifically. So I felt like I had an idea of what I needed to train for going into it. And I had watched Matteo Pilon's video on YouTube a bunch of the route, and had an idea of like what moves I needed to work, where I thought the cruxes were going to be. And then I got there and I feel like I just was like totally surprised on how like really, really was faced with like, what are my strengths and what are my weaknesses? And the projecting of this route, I think parallel for me was like, is really at my physical limit. So not to say that like Line wasn't and Oblivion wasn't, but I think I had more kind of flexibility and it wasn't quite there. Whereas like, I feel like Parallel World for me is like right at the edge of my ability. It is like the hardest thing I've ever tried to do. And that was new. So trying to navigate, how do I project something that is really, really hard for me? How do I project something that I might not have like perfectly trained for, essentially? So when I had trained for this route, I'm a really strong endurance climber. The day my last endurance training in the roof, I had over an hour of climbing in the roof. Like I could feel like I could just hang on for a really long time. My weaknesses lie in my power, like doing powerful moves one after the other. And so I had hopped on Parallel World, sat through the moves and looked at a bunch of the holds and started to realize, okay, there's going to be some powerful climbing in here, and was able to work some of the sections and some of the moves. And then one section that I did not think was going to be a problem at all. There was a hold that had been filled with like a hard epoxy that, from my knowledge, I think a lot of the people that have climbed the route before, I'm not going to say all because I don't know, but I think a lot of the people who have climbed the route before have used this hold. So that was a big surprise. And I had this like pretty significant emotional high and frustration. I think I was a little pissed off, honestly, because I was like, this doesn't feel fair that this was an option for people before me. And now it just made the move ginormous and huge and like really at my limit. And it didn't feel possible. And eventually I found like it is possible. It's just right at my limit. And so it felt like, I feel like I, had thought I was going to get one thing because I'd watched videos of people climb it. And then I came and it was totally different. And then it was also an interesting process because Darius Sokolowski, who had put up the route, was there working a new line in the cave. And he was able to confirm he put the epoxy there to bring the route back to the standard of how he did it when he originally put the route up, specifically for that move. And I think now that I'm removed and looking back on it in hindsight, I think it actually is good for the route. And I think it helps kind of elevate it back up a little bit. But at the time, it was really hard to kind of process. So this trip specifically for the projecting process, like I was just trying to navigate, like pushing myself every day on some really hard moves and trying not to rush myself. Like I had a little bit of an expectation of what it felt like on previous trips. And I was kind of like, okay, I should be red pointing by now. And then I'd try to like red point. I'm like, I'm not even close. Like I need to take a big step back and move back towards the projecting. So it's hard to say like exactly the projecting style that I have, in the sense that I do know for sure my projecting style is slow, but every route that I've done to this point, the projecting has gone really differently and I've learned something new. And this trip was my biggest learning and growth to date.
So the hold had been filled in, but you were able to figure out an alternate strategy, right? Because like you're dealing with what is presented to you, regardless of what's happened in the past. But we can talk about how that might change the grading going forward. Maybe you want to talk about that now. But just the physical process of encountering this unexpectedly filled hold, how did you approach that to actually end up making the move happen? Like, what was the progression like there? And like, how did you actually work through the facts on the ground? This is what you're dealing with.
Yeah, the way that you said like alternate way through. And I kind of feel like it's better to look at it of like being more like, I think the hold that was filled was an alternate way through that, versus now you have to do the original move. Now it's back to the way that Derek was when he first sent the route. I'm mostly clarifying so people kind of have an idea of like what that hold was and what it is now. When I first saw that it was filled and I tried to do that move, and then the next move after that is a really hard move as well, a big Gaston. I tried to do both of them and I couldn't do it, and I came down and I cried. I said, I don't think I can do this. And had this like big, ginormous weight of like, oh my God, I just spent all of this time training and all of this money to get here, and I can't do it, was like how it felt. And to like kind of build up the bravery and whatever to get back up there and try again felt like a lot of work, especially because getting to those holds is so hard. Like it is so much work to get there. It's not just like I can stick clip up to it and pull on the rope and get there kind of thing. Like it doesn't even matter if I'm going from bolt to bolt. Like it's a fair amount of climbing just to get to the crux moves to work them.
Yeah, just for context, where is it in the route? Like
it's not quite halfway if you're including the D10 start. If we're looking at just the roof, it's about maybe like a quarter or slightly to a third of the way through the roof. If anybody knows the cave and where the Edge of Tomorrow anchor is, that's the hold you leave from. And then you hop on to continue to Parallel World from there. So yeah, there was kind of this, I had to build myself up to get to that move every time I was working it. And then it was just like constant where do I need to put my foot? Where do I need to put my hand? Like micro beta of like, what if I hold my tool with my thumb on the outside of the pommel? Or what if I take my tool so my pinky's not on the pommel? It's just like my first 3 fingers on the tool. And like, how do I, if I do hit it, like how do I turn, which do I need to turn clockwise or counterclockwise in relation to the draw? But then if you do hit it, like my left tool is getting stuck. So how do I hit it and then put my flag foot on to be able to push back to get my tool unstuck? And what's the best way of the angle to get my tool unstuck? So it was weeks and weeks of working that move to be able to, I think my percentage of hitting it right now is like pretty low. But the progression was being able to not hit it at all and feeling like it wasn't possible to now it's definitely possible. It just is pretty limit. That in itself is huge. A big part of that was learning how to be excited about even the micro positives than like the negatives. So it kind of came down to like, oh my gosh, today of the 20 times I hit or I attempted the move, I hit it 10 times of those 20 times or something like that. Like that's huge. That's really good. But then some days I would go up there and I would try it that many times and I'd hit it like 3 times. So my percentage would go way down. So just trying to like find the positives in the day, and some days the negatives would outweigh the positives and it would feel really dire and pretty down. And in general, it was very much trying to like trust the process and being like, this is what hard projecting is, and learning this move and like getting comfortable with the move was a big part of that projecting. And trying to like believe in myself a little bit. That was a move that if I was having a not good day mentally, there was no way it was going to go. Like I had to be kind of perfect in my head game to feel positive enough to be able to do it.
But you were there for a few months and you were committed to continuing to try the route and that move specifically. How do you maintain your dedication and then also your fitness too, to be able to consistently be able to work that during, because you are there for, how long were you there for?
2 months.
So how do you maintain, in addition to the mental component, like physically maintaining your fitness? Because if you're projecting, you're not necessarily doing red point burns every time and keeping that endurance up per se. And so did you see your power potentially improve as you were projecting this?
Oh gosh, yeah. It is one of those things of like you train really hard going into a trip, and then during the trip you absolutely lose strength and endurance. So throughout the trip I had some side projects that I was working. So on days where I just like mentally couldn't get the muster to like work parallel world, I would hop on another route. So I was working Je ne sais quoi, which is a D14 plus. I was working French Connection, which is a 15 minus, and then Invocation, which is a D14, D14 plus, depending on who you ask. Invocation is just basically the beginning of Parallel World, and then you go to the Tomorrow's World Anchor. So that there wasn't a lot of projecting there, but for the other two, it was really great for me mentally to just like get on something else. And those were great to like work my endurance and like keep my endurance up. I think when I climbed French Connection, it was, I can't remember exactly the time, but somewhere around 30-ish minutes, maybe slightly more, maybe 32 minutes. So, and that was at the very end of the trip that I did French Connection. That was like a couple days before we left. So I feel like my endurance was still there and I didn't lose a lot of endurance on the trip, which is great. I think overall my power, it's hard to say because I hurt my back halfway through the trip. So working the power moves went down a lot after that injury. So I do think that I lost definitely some power strength, but I think in regards to like overall endurance, I don't think I actually lost that much. I think my endurance is still pretty high. In general, just having side projects that I'm not just sitting on the rope for the entire time, that I can do big links and trying to make sure that like if I am in the place to red point Parallel World, I have the endurance in the tank to do it.
You talked about how Parallel World felt like a big step up in difficulty from the progression you had been accustomed to from D14 to D15 to Parallel World. But with the side quests, you tried different grades, D14 plus, 15 minus, things like that. How did that give you a different sense of maybe what the progression of difficulties were there? Because stylistically, they're all well, I'll ask, like stylistically, are they all similar? And I guess like, is there something different about Parallel World that makes it harder? Are you able to maybe distill down more about like grade progression and then sort of like what the distinction is in difficulty there for the different routes now?
Yeah, I'll do my best.
For your understanding.
Yeah, from my understanding and from my experience, which I feel like it's worth just being like very clear with people. Like, I don't have a lot of experience out of what I've climbed and hopped on here in Highlight Canyon at the Bingo Cave and Tomorrow's World. So this is going off of like the things that I've climbed and the things that I've hopped on. So in Tomorrow's World, it really felt like a consistent progression from Edge of Tomorrow to Oblivion to Line. And then when I think about like Je ne sais quoi and French Connection, Je ne sais quoi being a 14 plus and French Connection being a 15 minus, like I would say it feels appropriate. It's a little bit hard to say because they were two different trips. I think in general, all those routes feel like in that cave a pretty consistent progression. That being said, all of those routes from Edge to Oblivion to Line to French Connection to Je ne sais quoi are Tom Ballard routes. And then Parallel World was put up by somebody else, Derek Sokolowski. So for me, Parallel World feels so much harder than kind of the other stuff because maybe somebody else put it up. It's just a different style. But in my experience, the route just feels quite significantly more difficult. That being said, I'm definitely not giving it a grade. I haven't climbed it, and I don't feel like even when I do climb it, I feel like I need to get more experience at the kind of the other grades to get a really good perspective on where it's at on the grading scale. But for me, Parallel World, everything in the cave, like Line has some big moves on it, but there's no move on Line that's like a stopper move for me. There was no move that was like, there's a good chance I can't do this move kind of thing. I was able to like hit everything first time, was able to work everything and like get it pretty fast. Versus Parallel World, there was a lot of moments where we're like, I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I can do this move in isolation, let alone trying to do this move after 30 plus minutes of climbing or 55 meters of climbing or however you want to measure it. Starts on a D10 and there are quite a few good rests, especially if you are primarily a DTS climber. Like if you are good at finding feet on rests, I think that would really benefit. And then it starts off with like some bigger, powerful moves in the beginning of the route. And you have like a fairly good rest before you get to the crux for me. I think it's like 9-ish moves into the roof, which is a really big sideways moving to a reverse grip. It's a blind hold. It's hard to see. It's hard to hit. And then you have a really large, powerful Gaston move after that. And then it's basically endurance climbing with some hard moves nearish the end. They're like middle, other half. So like 3/4 of the way through the route, there's some hardish moves on your grip position. And then the last move is ginormous and a real could be heartbreaker. And I know it's been a heartbreaker for some people. So it just kind of feels like in comparison, the moves are way bigger. There's more power involved. You can't just be an endurance climber because for me, if that was the case, I would have been able to climb it, in my opinion. I had more than enough endurance in my training and in my tank to be able to climb the route if it was just endurance based. For me, that's how Line felt, is there was some big moves in there and there absolutely was a crux near the end. But as long as I was having like a good day endurance wise, like I was pretty positive I was going to be able to climb it. Whereas Parallel World, I have the endurance, but I just didn't quite have the power to make it happen this trip, which is okay. And I learned a lot and have something to work towards, but it's hard to really know grading wise. All I know and all that I can speak on is it feels a lot harder. The comparison between the grades, to me, it feels a lot harder. But I don't think I can actually speak on what I think it is until after I climb it and some other routes to compare.
So if a crag is a canvas and you have a painter, depending on the rock and what's available, you're sort of going to put your own mark and style on it. Sokolovsky established parallel world. It's not a Ballard route. And so there's that, it's his own maybe style. So there's that sort of differentiation. The question, I guess, really specifically is these moves are more powerful and bigger. And this might be a weird question, but like, could you just provide a little bit more specifics about like your height and your ape index? Because it just seems like reach is very, very important. And it seems like maybe one trend that I've seen is to increase the difficulty is just like really, really big moves. Because there was a route in Bulgaria that it's claimed it's a D15 or D15 plus. I don't remember, but they basically like I think it's the developer. It might be just someone attempting it, but basically they say like if you're under 180 centimeters, so if you're under like 5'11", like it's impossible, which just seems like a ridiculously arbitrary way to design a route. Like if it's rock climbing, there are morpho routes, don't get me wrong, that can increase or decrease the difficulty depending on like your reach, but like there's usually ways to get around a move. And so I'm asking quite a bit. So maybe we can just start with like, if it's at your physical limit, like what are we dealing with as far as like your box, like your reach and things like that?
To like give you some context, I am 5'6", and I'm using, I think this is important to note, I've been using stock Gen 2 Nomics, so not extended handles or anything like that. And I've climbed all the routes that I've ever climbed on these tools. They're my very, very first pair of tools. So they're somehow still going strong. And I think my ape index is like +1 or +2. But yeah, this is a conversation that we've talked a lot about. In rock climbing, obviously, like height does make a big difference. Some routes are easier when you're short and some routes are easier when you're tall. In general, I think in dry tooling, it often benefits you to be more tall, just because like you said, a lot of routes that become more difficult often have bigger moves. Yeah, I'd be curious to see what that route is like, because I do think when you have maybe a height limitation or a tool limitation or whatever it may be that you're encountering, oftentimes there are ways to get creative, whether that just like is how you use your feet, how you hold your tools, et cetera, but maybe not quite as readily available as it would be rock climbing when you kind of have the whole wall to work with. I think this is worth mentioning that this is one of the really difficult things about dry tooling is the part that oftentimes these really hard routes are manufactured. And so when you come to climb a route, how important is it that you use the original holds that were put up by the first ascensionists and to climb the route with those original holds? For example, like that hold being filled on Parallel World, right? Like that hold wasn't there, but somebody found it. It's on the bolt line and they used it. So do you use the original holds? Is it important to use just the original holds, or is it important to just follow the bolt line? I'm not saying one or the other is better. I'm just saying that this is kind of a question within the sport, especially just because dry tooling holds can break. You can make dry tooling holds over time. Like the more that you use a hold, the better it's going to get usually. It's hard to say, like, when you're climbing, you might see a hold that the first ascensionist didn't use, and you might be able to use it to make a move smaller or whatever. So it's hard to really have like a concrete answer about height and wingspan, when I do think oftentimes you can get creative and routes change, and depending on what happens and whatever, things are constantly kind of in this ever-changing bubble of dry tooling. But somebody has said to me too, like, I don't think you would be able to do this route because you're not tall enough. So like that has been a comment to me, and it's kind of one of those of like, oh, it makes me maybe not want to go check the route out. Like it kind of puts me off a little bit, but at the same time, I'm like, it's probably worth putting on my list to just go see if that's true. Or if it's like, maybe I can get creative. Because for example, like that move on Parallel World that I was like, there's no way I can do this. Like with a little bit of time, I was able to figure it out. And now I have beta to be able to get through the move. Maybe not like 100% of the times I try it, but I can do it. I'm capable of doing it. And all the other moves on the route. But it took some time to like figure out my personal beta to get through it. So it's hard to just have this like, yep, some routes are not possible if you're a certain height, which might be the case. That might be true. And that might just be one of the downsides of dry tooling. But at the same time, like, who knows? People can be really creative with their solutions.
There's so much gray area too. Like, how creative can you be? Like, if the route, if the hold is not originally part of the route, like, can you use a divot or some, like, obviously you're not going to go and drill a new hold, but like, can you find some sort of alternate solution as like an intermediary?
Exactly.
Right? Like, when does that, like, where does the line get crossed? One of the challenges is you have a limited playlist, let's call it, right? Like, you've climbed mostly at Bingo Cave and then here. And so there's like, from what I understand, there's just a lot of discrepancy between grading, you know, it veils kind of like all over from what I hear, and other places too. Like, it's like everyone sort of seems to have their own grading. With that said, Tom's Cave does seem to have the most repeats at these higher grades. So there is, it's almost like the baseline, let's say, or like the benchmark. I guess, how important is it to you to be able to know, quote unquote, what like a D15 feels like? Like, do you feel like you need to go and try other, I actually don't even know how many other D15s are in the world, but like, how do you feel like you need to get sort of a comparison? Or is it more important for you just to train for like this route in particular in Tom's Cave? Like where are you thinking around getting more of like a broader perspective or not for grades?
Yeah, I would say in general, the long-term goal is to climb more harder grades and be able to have a general consensus of the hard routes around the world. Like, that's my big goal, is to spend the next few years working these routes and to feel like I have an opinion to really stand on and be able to back myself up. Because like you said, right now, like, I don't have this huge base of knowledge of routes around the world. My experience lies in the Bingo Cave and Tom's Cave. I really would like to, even just for my own knowledge, like, climb different routes. So when I look back and I'd be like, okay, well, Ironman felt like this compared to Line, and Alethea felt like this compared to Parallel World, and be like, I climbed these and this is my opinion on them. I don't want to come out and say like, this is this grade and this is this grade, because I think this is kind of going into the conversation of grading and dry tooling a little bit. I think in general, like the grades of dry tooling are really complicated. That also comes from like rock climbing grades are really complicated, and dry tooling grades are also really complicated. There's so many factors in dry tooling that can make it complicated. And so for me, like, I really want to try to have this general idea of kind of the hard grades around the world, so I can give my opinion to help us kind of find a consensus on the grading. And I think really what makes the grades of dry tooling pretty difficult to figure out is even though we're a small sport, there's a pretty big divide in the sport. Like, on one side, we kind of have our DTS climbers, which stands for dry tool style. And then on the other side, we have our Aniiu climbers, and there's this pretty big division between the two. And unfortunately, it's really, in my opinion, kind of holding back the sport and being able to navigate our way through the sport. And then on top of that, there's just not a lot of people climbing the top level of the grades. And there's not a lot of routes in the world that are at the top level of the grades. And so you have like a new route go in and somebody gives it this opinion or for the grade, and then nobody else climbs it, or somebody climbs it and it's changed. So it's like, it's kind of one of those things of the more people that we have at this level of the sport that give an opinion, the more likely we are to kind of find an overall average of grade, is kind of what I think is maybe a direction, but it's a little bit hard to get to that when there is this huge divide with like Aniiu and DTS climbing. And then on top of that, I think there's this big from cave to cave differences in grading. So you kind of brought this up about what's going on in Vail, and I've never climbed in Vail, so I can't speak for that. I'm just purely going off of opinions that I've heard through the grapevine. But what I can say is like having gotten on some of the original routes in the Bingo Cave and comparing to them to how the routes in Tomorrow's World, like they feel way softer than what's going on in Tomorrow's World. But with that being said, Kevin has been putting up some hard routes in the Bingo Cave that feel a lot more accurate to the grading because Kevin has spent a lot of time building his knowledge of what a D13 feels like, of what a D14 feels like. And so then when he goes in to develop in the Bingo Cave, I think his grading is a lot more accurate versus I wouldn't be surprised if some of the original routes in the Bingo Cave just naturally get downgraded because of like as the sport grows, that just might be the natural progression for some of those original routes around the world. And like because there's again this division, like some of the solutions that people have said there maybe needs to be is like 2 grades for every route. It has a DTS grade and it has a Aniiu grade, and I think we kind of see that with Parallel World a little bit, right? Like we've had every person that's climbed it in DTS, which has been Derek and Victor climbed it in May of this year, but they both gave it yes, they both gave it a D16 in DTS style. Everybody else that's climbed it in Aniiu style has given it 15 plus. So we're kind of naturally seeing this division between style grading. And I'm not saying that that's the direction we should go. I'm just saying that that is like something that we've kind of been seeing, especially because Parallel World is what seems to be the most hard repeated route in the world at this point. You know, so it's like, it's a little bit one of those things of, do you differentiate the route with 2 different grades, or do you have like a bunch of people find or climb the route and use the grade that like best describes the route kind of for both styles? And I'm not really sure if that is a solution at all. And especially because when I look at the 2 different styles, I think in general for me, like I'm a Aniiu style and I can do some DTS moves, but in general, DTS is really, really hard for me. But with that being said, I do think that the style that you do the most is going to feel easier. It's kind of like if you never go for a run and you go for a run and it feels pretty hard versus if you run all the time, it's going to feel a little bit easier. So it's maybe that's kind of similar. I think in general, a lot of people have said that like DTS is harder. And for me, DTS feels really hard. Like trying to do Parallel World DTS would be impossible for me, 100%. But I also just never trained DTS. So maybe it would feel better if I did train DTS. It's hard to say. So it's kind of one of those of, I think in general, which one you train is going to feel a little bit easier. But also, this is where my opinion comes in. Like, if we want the sport to grow, this division of you can only come here and climb if you're a DTS style climber. You can't count that route you just did because you didn't do it in DTS style. Trying to be more accepting of any style that anybody does needs to be, in my opinion, kind of the progression of the sport. Because if we want things to grow, if we want to move towards that overall consensus of what the grades for these routes are, like there kind of needs to be a little bit more collaboration of both styles. And I think both styles are awesome. And like, I'm always impressed by somebody who's a really strong DTS climber because it's something that I'm really, really bad at. And I think it's really amazing to watch a great DTS climber. But there's a lot of crags that I'd love to go to that I'm a little scared to go to because I'm not a DTS climber. And I think it holds back the sport. So yeah, that's a super long-winded answer of general grading and Parallel World and how it compares to kind of other stuff on the other side of the world and grading in general.
Okay, so deviation. Where are all the female drytoolers at the highest end? So there's only a handful. I mean, to be fair, there's only a handful of men too, but it seems like women are much less represented.
Yeah, I would agree. There's definitely lots of really hard female drytoolers, I feel like, in the comp scene, for sure. Kat Shirley, Marianne Vandersteen, Haruko. Like, these are all women that are climbing really hard. And especially like Marianne and Haruko are out there also putting up or like climbing hard routes outside as well as like in the comp scene. But in regards to like kind of women out here, like just doing the outdoor stuff, I don't know. I mean, Angelica obviously came from the comp scene and she climbs really hard, but she hasn't been doing kind of the hard outdoor dry tool stuff in a while, at least from my knowledge. She's climbing really hard on rock at the moment. But yeah, I'm not sure.
515 climber.
I know.
Strong.
She's so strong. She's really inspiring. She's awesome. But yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know. I keep tried to do like a women's climbing clinic this summer at the Mountain Project and only got a couple signups. So I don't know. I don't know where they're at.
Along those lines, you are a bit of a different bird in the scene too, because you don't do comp climbing. Mm-hmm. And I guess the obvious question is, do you have any interest in comp climbing? Like, is that something you might consider at some point?
Yeah, Kevin's tried to convince me to comp climb for a long time. It's hard because I really love following the comp scene. Like, I watch the comps on YouTube and the whole thing, and I kind of see how the season is shaping out, and I find it really interesting. But at the same time, like, I kind of feel like I had my competition years a little bit. Like, I did that with horses. I really pushed myself competitively. And I think my competitive side of me with horses was something that kind of contributed a little bit to the burnout, because I just didn't know how to do horses without the competitive side of it. I did years of competing. I competed from the time I was 7 to, I think, my last competition, I was like 20 or 21. And I was competing every year. So I did a lot of time of competition and like that performance on the spot kind of thing. And there's a part of me that just kind of feels like I've done it, and I love to watch it, and I love to support the climbers that do it. I think it's incredibly impressive. What they're doing is amazing. I just don't have that really big desire to like push myself in that way anymore. So I don't ever see myself competing. Honestly, like, I don't know if I will compete in any other sport again, but maybe I will someday. I'll get the itch, but right now I don't have that itch, even though as much as I love to like kind of watch it from afar.
You mentioned being very, I guess, like specific with your diet. Mm-hmm. Because in a handful of conversations we've had so far, it does seem like in climbing specifically, you know, it's body image in particular, mm-hmm. and sort of like this ideal body type and et cetera is like part of, it's like an expectation or association almost. And I wonder if that's something that, like, how you think about nutrition as far as like performance goes, off season and in season.
Yeah. Obviously, I think this has come up in the media in the last couple of years of climbing and diet and good ways to do it and poor ways to do it. Yeah, I think for me, I love to eat. I could eat all day long kind of thing. So for me, it's always been about finding the balance of eating enough to stay strong and to build muscle and to fuel myself, but not eating too much. And so for me, like, it's also very important as a female athlete to make sure you're getting enough protein and eating the right things to be able to process protein, because the way that our hormones work, depending on where we're in our cycle, our body will not actually, and maybe I'm not 100% right on this, it's worth doing research, but my understanding is that our body won't process protein correctly, and it'll actually start like using our muscle that we have built as fuel. So it's really important to be eating the right things to make sure you're fueling your body correctly. And so that has been really important for me. And just so for me, like tracking what I'm eating to make sure I'm having enough protein intake every day, I'm having enough water, but making sure like I'm not eating too much. Especially just because, like, I think And I mostly am doing this like while I'm in like a training cycle, and I want to do it in a healthy way. So it's really important to me to make sure like I'm not trying to condense like a diet and like lose weight a couple weeks before a climb, because there's no way you can do that healthily, versus like creating good habits over 8 months of time and like being like, okay, like for me, my peak performance weight, I want it to be this, but making sure that for me personally, like that's still a healthy weight, eating the right foods to get to that point, and also making sure that like I'm happy. If I'm not eating enough, I'm usually fairly crabby, and that's a good indicator. And so I think just having like an idea of like what you need what you like and what you need to be fueling yourself with to feel happy on the climb and in general while training. But making sure that for me, like I'm doing it in a way that I can be at my peak performance is pretty important.
A few more questions. And you'd mentioned before that you have 2 sponsors, one of them being Aniiu Gloves, who also happens to be a sponsor of this podcast. So thank you very much to Doug and Aniiu.
Yay, Aniiu.
And Colleen and everyone else there. Takashima. Specifically though, you have a cool project in the works. Do you want to talk about what you've been developing with them?
Yeah. So we've been working on a dry tooling specific glove, which I'm really excited about. I think it's worth just saying, like, I think most dry toolers use golf gloves, and golf gloves, they only sell one glove. And so you're constantly trying to buy 2, and usually one's harder to find, and they often don't hold up to the wear and tear that we put on them on a day-to-day basis. And it can be really frustrating. And I feel like I had reached out to a few different golf companies and hoped that they might be interested, to no avail, and then reached out to Doug, and he was immediately stoked and excited on it. And he's just been so supportive and really amazing for myself and for the sport in general, I think. So I told him like I really wanted to create a dry tooling specific glove that was comfortable, as well as like had some like significant technical ability and be able to hold up for more than one long, heavy burn. And he was immediately down. So we started with a glove that already existed, which was a batting glove made in the same factory. So we kind of had an idea of like how it was made, and I climbed on them, and I thought immediately, I was like, oh, these are better than any golf glove I've ever used. And so they held up a lot better. They had a little bit of a thicker leather, even though the back of the hand was synthetic material, which I didn't love, and was kind of stretchy in the worst ways. Like we learned a lot from that glove of like what worked well and what didn't work well. And we moved from there to creating the first prototype. And so the first prototype is all leather. It's made out of a goat leather from Pakistan, and it's a little bit thicker, and it's really durable. And I really wanted to make sure that it had like a wider cuff that would allow, like it wouldn't pinch quite as much on like the blood vessels in your wrist, but it would hang, like the Velcro was good enough that it wasn't going to slide off your hand, like still worthy of taping the wrist area, but like the glove wasn't going to slide under the tape, essentially. Like it wasn't going to pull through was my goal. And I wanted to make sure that we had like wraparound leather around the pinky, so there wasn't like a middle seam sitting right on the outside of your pinky, right on the tool. And you had the kind of like extra support under your pinky, as well as like a wraparound leather on the pointer finger. So when you're in reverse grip, you had like a similar style there.
You say there's going to be like, is there padding on the?
It's not padding. There's
like
just like,
pinky, or?
It's just like another piece of leather there for durability. Just because like that's a part of the glove that's like always has the tool sitting on it kind of thing. It just like, the idea was to make the gloves make sense around the tool. Like how does your hand sit on the tool and the glove is working around that versus you like kind of having to work around the glove. So the first prototype came out. I really wanted to make sure that the stitching was really durable. Like all of my gloves were ripping. They were pulling through and just falling apart, literally like at the seams. And so the first glove came out and immediately was better than anything I've ever used in the past. I was able to train on it leading into the trip. I think I had 2 30-minute roof burns on it. I had a 45-minute roof burn on it and an hour plus roof burn on the gloves. And then I took them to Italy. I climbed Je ne sais quoi on them, the same pair of prototype gloves. And I projected Parallel World in the gloves. And they are still held together, except for at one time I was going into a 9 and my rake hit the outside of the glove and just ripped it slightly. And that's the only rip that's in it. And it hasn't gotten any bigger since. And I still use the gloves. I just used the gloves the other day. And now we've improved the gloves even from that first prototype set. But just like the fact that I'm still using that first pair should say a lot, because I've never used any glove that long ever. And the fact that they're still holding up and working that well is pretty exceptional. So I'm super excited to share them with everybody. I think we've come up with a super awesome product. I find that the leather is a little bit thicker in good ways, in my opinion, in the sense that like I think when you're on tools for a long time, skincare can be super tricky. And so having a slightly thicker leather, more durable leather is a little bit kinder to your skin on the really long burns. And that's kind of what we're looking for. So hoping to have these gloves out August 2025 is the plan. So keep an eye out for them.
What's the name for these? Is it going to be like the Andra, but like the McKinstry Stylos D15 Plus or something? Or...
That would be a great name.
Do you get your name on it?
Andra McKinstry Stylos D15 Plus. No, I think they're...
Maybe we could scratch the Andra part.
I think we talked about doing the Vincent comp. And then Doug is also working on like a thin mixed glove, which I think are going to be the Vincent mixed. So, but I was hesitant to just call them dry because I was afraid that people were going to see the dry and be slightly confused and think that there might be insulation in them. Whereas like these gloves have zero insulation. Like they're the thinnest and most technical glove in the line. Whereas I think comp really says that more than dry does. So we decided to go with the Vincent comp.
The McKinstry comp, not comp glove.
Yeah.
Question from the audience. Mm-hmm. This one from Bob Perna. You've been building a repertoire for routes around the world. And part of what you've been talking about is being able to maybe provide your educated opinion about grade consensus and things like that. Another way to do that is also to develop routes. Do you have any interest, or have you bolted new routes?
Yeah, great question. So Joe and I have done some bolting and highlight, very easy beginner routes from like D4 to can't remember, 6 or 7, something like that.
Do you even remember what D4 feels like?
It's so hard. I feel like D4 is hard. Like my calves can't take it. And it's usually so bouncy.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It's like D4 is like alpine scary slab or something, you know? But yeah, so we've done a micro amount of developing, and it's been fun and interesting. But I think right now my focus is definitely on climbing. And especially because I think it would be really fun to bolt and to develop routes. But dry tooling is really difficult because there's not a lot of places in the world where there's big caves that are accessible to dry toolers, and that it's okay to put in big routes like this. It's not like they're just sitting around waiting for us to come in and develop them. And with that being said, it's really important for me to have the baseline of like, I know what a D14 feels like, and I know what a D13 feels like. So if I do have the itch to develop, I can go into it with the idea of like, not only do I feel confident that this is a D14, but I also feel confident that this is like a good D14, and that this is going to be a fun D14, and that people can come and enjoy this route. And I don't feel like my experience is there yet. Ask me this question in a few years once I've climbed more routes, and we'll see if I have more interest in bolting. Okay. But I also don't know how to bolt in roofs. I need Kevin to like give me a crash course and help me learn how to develop roof routes.
Specifically in dry tooling, because it is a smaller niche. Who do you think should get more recognition that hasn't for one reason or another?
Yeah, I thought about this question a little bit, and I was thinking that for me, the first person that comes to mind is Matteo Pilon in Italy, who I've gotten to know a little bit, and he's been great on sharing beta and his routes in Belluno. He is probably one of the hardest dry toolers in the world, and I just don't feel like he gets a lot of recognition for some of the stuff he's put up, including having just, obviously he put up Alethea, but then he also put up, I just finished Teleos last year, and it just kind of flew under the radar, proposed D16 plus, and I've looked at that route, and it is hard. It is by far, I haven't touched the holds, I haven't tried the moves, but I've looked at it from the ground, and it is close to the ground, and it is significantly harder than anything I've ever seen. But not only is he putting up hard routes, but like there's this cave near his home, and it's called Tana dell'Orso, and it kind of fell to the wayside and was forgotten about, and not a lot of people knew about it, and he really took it upon himself to invest his time, his money, his knowledge into having this cave be super well-rounded, from putting in routes from, beginner like D4, D5 or something like this, all the way to D15, and then sharing it with the community. And there is not a lot of people out there who are putting that much time into the sport and development of a single cave and kind of bringing it back to life a little bit, but also bringing in new people to the sport. Like there's a lot of amazing programs for the comp climbing scene. Like I know Marianne and Dennis are doing amazing stuff. I know that there's like a Scottish dry tooling club, like the Coop in the States is doing a lot of stuff, but there's not a lot of people that are just bringing up people into the outdoor climbing scene of the sport. And Matteo is like, this last weekend, he just had his big dry tooling get together for the weekend, and to see how many people were there and like the fun and making the sport interesting for all levels. And that is really cool. And that he's doing a great job of getting people involved and developing hard routes and beginner friendly routes too. And that's pretty important, I think.
Yeah, I want to give a shout out to Matteo too, because he helped me prep for this call. So thank you, Matteo.
Thanks, Matteo.
If you were to give your younger self one piece of beta, what would that be?
Well, my current piece of beta that I've been telling myself this entire last trip was trust the process. I wrote it in my daily log at like the base of my overall feeling of the day was trust the process. And I think about that kind of my childhood and like growing up and like horses and difficulties with that and like changing sports and whatever. Like it's just kind of the theme, like trust the process, trust that the good days and the hard days and whatever are all a part of the bigger picture to like meeting those goals. I literally have it like written down at the base of my notes in my training log. It's just like a daily reminder.
Well, thank you very much, Katie, for chatting today.
Yeah, of course.
Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. Thanks for giving back to the sport in this way.
To follow Katie on social, she's at Katie_Stylos, Stylos on Instagram. And to check out her artwork, you can head to hyalightdesigns.com. Hyalite is HYALITE designs.com. As always, thank you to Hannah Noel for providing the intro music and Andrew Solomon for editing. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.